Hi, Steve from Steve M Outdoors, and today we're going to do a short and convoluted history of the Swedish M96 rifle, more popularly probably referred to as the Swedish Mauser, although the history of the rifle's usage is hardly short, and I guess I'll do the glamour shot. It's a long one, this Swedish M96 Mauser. Whoa, here we are. So to provide some historical context, up until the 1880s, many European powers were still using single-shot black powder rifles. Now the problem with black powder is that basically after a few volleys, you've essentially created a smoke screen in front of you, and that kind of prevents your troops from accurately firing at the opposing troops. Moreover, another issue with black powder is that it tends to propel bullets slowly and with a pronounced parabolic curve. Now that issue was resolved, or solved, I suppose, in 1884 when a Frenchman, and I'm going to read the name because I'll murder it otherwise, Paul-Marie Eugene Vail, invented modern nitrocellulose based smokeless gunpowder. Now, as the name suggests, it produces far less smoke, but more importantly, it actually tends to propel the bullet much faster and with a flatter trajectory. So what does that mean? In practical terms, bullets can travel out to greater distances and with more accuracy. So that kind of lengthened the battlefield. So now the European powers also realized something a little belatedly that they could have learned from the 1861 to 1865 American Civil War, and that was the value of the repeating rifle. And as an aside, they probably also could have learned about trench warfare, which was a small aspect, but nonetheless an aspect of the Civil War, something that they were going to experience to dreadful effect in a few decades' time. So the Union deployed repeating rifles like the Henry repeating rifle to devastating effect. The Confederate soldiers joked that a Union soldier could load his repeating rifle on Sunday and fire all week. And that presented a great tactical advantage to Union troops, particularly with massed charges from Confederate cavalry and troops. They could just basically unload without having to fire, load, fire, load. They could produce a greater volume of fire. It wasn't until the Russo-Turkish War, specifically the siege of Plevna in 1877, when the Russian 1869 Kirnka rifle, which was a single-shot rifle, was pretty much outclassed by the Turkish Winchester repeating rifles, specifically the model 1866 Winchester rifle. Now, the Russians won that war, but they learned the hard way that a repeating rifle was very useful on the battlefield. So the European powers, again, belatedly picked up that lesson. So to switch back now to the Swedish story, like a lot of nations in Europe near the end of the 20th century, the Swedes kind of realized that the day of the single-shot black powder rifle was coming to an end. They were using at the time the model 1867-1889 rolling block rifle, which was in use by a lot of countries at the time, including the United States for a period. And it was chambered in 8x58 millimeter Danish Craig. Now, around the early 1890s, the Swedes decided, okay, it was time to replace the rolling block rifle. So they began to hold some trials in order to pick its successor. Now, out of the trial process came two basic rifles, the M94 carbine, and a little later in 1896, the M96 rifle, which both of them were chambered in 6.5 by 55 millimeter. Now, the rifle is essentially an improved version of Paul Mauser's model 1893. A couple of key differences. Also, the Swedish rifle's bolt, I'll show that to you now, only had 2 locking lugs, whereas the standard Mauser of the day, of course I can't remove it now when I want to, oh, safety's on. At least we know that works. The bolt has 2 locking lugs, one here and one here. So locking lug on both sides. Mausers tended to have 3 locking lugs. Now, 2 locking lugs doesn't mean this rifle's more unsafe than the other Mauser rifles, but the more locking lugs you have, the safer the rifle tends to be, and also the more accurate, because there's more surfaces for the bolt to lock into. So, although it was approved in 1896, it took time for the Swedish arms industry to tool up. And it actually kind of took a little bit of time for the rifle to come into action. The rifle actually came into service in 1898, so 2 years after it was approved. Now, Mauser in Germany actually produced the first batch of rifles in 1899 and 1900. They produced another batch because Carl Gustav, which started producing the rifles in 1896, were going a little bit slow. So Mauser came on in 1899, 1900 to produce additional rifles. There was also a run produced by Husqvarna during the Second World War, and all told they produced about 475,000 rifles. Now, there are kind of interesting notes about this rifle. The Swedish had some very specific conditions when it came to the production of the rifle, whether it was Carl Gustav, Husqvarna, or Mauser in Germany. They wanted a specific steel, which was supplied by the Swedes, which, and I'm going to read it because it's a bit of a list, nickel, copper, and vanadium. Now, at the time, this was one of the most corrosion-resistant combinations of metals that you could produce when it came to steel. And that's pretty important when you're dealing with the climate that Sweden has with a lot of snow. Rifles do tend to corrode due to the moisture, condensation, the snow itself, water. So it's pretty important that these rifles were corrosion-resistant. Now, also because this rifle predates the 1898 Mauser, which ended up being adopted by Germany, and in a modified version as the Kar 98K in World War II. As I mentioned, it only has the 2 locking lugs. The M96 also has what's called a cock-on-closing action. So now what that basically means is, for a lot of rifles, when you open the bolt, that's when it cocks. The Mauser and the rifles like Lee Enfield's actually cock when you close it. As you can see, this is protruding out upon closing. Not a big difference, but it is a difference from the standard Mauser rifle. So if you know anything about the history of Europe during the 20th century, you know that Sweden was officially neutral during both wars. That doesn't mean, though, that the M96 didn't actually see combat service. Finland was provided with nearly 80,000 of the rifles during the 1939-1940 Winter War with Russia. You can tell a rifle that saw action during that war because the Finns stamped all the rifles that they used with SA, which is the Finnish acronym for Suomi Armeija, which basically means Finnish Army. By all accounts, the Finns did think fairly well of the rifle, which is high praise from a country that's known for producing accurate rifles themselves. The rifle was supplemented in 1938 by a rifle that was shorter by about 5.5 inches in the barrel, and that was called the M38. In reality, it's an M96 with a shorter barrel. In fact, many of the M38s were just M96 rifles that had the barrel cut by about 5 inches. Some sources say 7 inches, but most of the ones that I've seen say 5.5 inches. And you'll also notice that the cut down rifles have the bolt straight out. Purpose-built M38s actually have a turn down bolt. So this rifle actually had a fairly long lifespan. It survived until the 1950s, when it was kind of replaced by the AG M42 semi-automatic rifle, which in its turn was actually fairly quickly replaced by the AK4. Though some rear echelon units continue to use it all the way up until the early 1980s, and there were sniper variants of this rifle all the way up until the early 1990s. And yes, the rifle does have the famous brass disc, which basically will give you information about the quality of the rifle's barrel, as well as some other information. I do have a video on YouTube that I did last month on how to read these Swedish stock discs. There'll be a link at the end of the video, and I believe also a link in the description if you want to learn more about that. So what makes this rifle interesting to collectors? Since Sweden didn't fight in any wars during the 20th century, and if they were anything but anal about maintaining their firearms, a lot of these rifles are in absolutely fantastic condition. The cartridge that it fires, 6.5 by 55 millimeters, is a low recoil cartridge. It's relatively soft shooting to a lot of the ammunition that was used by other countries, like 8mm 303 British 30-06. It's still readily available, the ammunition, and a lot of guys and gals love to use it for hunting. It's a great deer round. It's also got flat trajectory and is fairly accurate. A lot of target shooters in Sweden to this day actually use the M96, whether the original or in a modified version known as the CG63, which were M38s and M96s that Carl Gustaf converted to target rifles. And Husqvarna actually has produced a lot of rifles using the M96 action with only minor modifications. Best of all, despite the fact that this is a rifle that's pretty valued by collectors, pristine M96s can be had for fairly reasonable prices. This example that I purchased last year, I think cost me a grand total of about 500 Canadian dollars, and it shoots far better than I'm capable of. The stock disc says that the bore isn't anywhere near pristine, somewhere middle of the road. But let me tell you, this thing shoots awesome. So this is a rifle that I would recommend a military surplus collector buy if they have a chance. It's accurate, soft shooting rifle, and it may not have the storied history that a lot of other rifles have. From the 20th century, I think it's definitely an excellent rifle to add to a collection. And if you're a reloader, components and load data are not hard to find at all. At any rate, that's it for the short and convoluted history of the M96 rifle. As always, if you liked what you saw, please feel free to share the video, like it, subscribe to the channel, hit that bell notification, whatever it is that everyone asks. You can find links below to my Twitter and Facebook pages. And as always, happy shooting, safe shooting.